Hello, and welcome to My Favorite Games, a podcast for game designers to geek out about games they love to play. Today, I'm super excited to host Tory Brown. Tory is the designer of Votes for Women, published by Fort Circle Games. She's a longtime resident of Washington, D.C., and an even longer time veteran of movement politics. Tory, thank you so much for coming on, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's lovely to be here.
A fellow Washingtonian, kind of. You came when I left.
Like ships passing in the night.
Like ships passing in the night, exactly. Before we kind of geek out about the game that you've kind of brought with you today, I know that your game design story is a bit different, and so it started during the pandemic. So yep. I'd love for you to take us back, set the scene. You know, how did you get involved in all this?
Sure. So really, my design story starts in the year 2000. Go way back to my freshman year of college. I met my friend Kevin, and Kevin and I stayed friends for many years. We both live in the area. I worked for a firm that he had, and he started a game publishing company. And the first title from Fort Circle is a game called Shores of Tripoli, about the Barbary Pirates and the first Marine incursion. And he kickstarted Shores of Tripoli, was looking around for this next game. Like, he couldn't find a publisher that he wanted to publish with, so he started his own. And then, you know, once you've got a publishing house, you gotta find games. So he asked everyone we knew, like, what do you think would be a good game? Oh, like, I'm looking for a next title. What do you think would be? And history and sort of less covered, right? Like marginalized or underappreciated moments in history. So not another Gettysburg battle game, if you know what I mean. And I, as a longtime feminist and activist and a veteran of movement politics, said to him, like, what you need to do is make a game about the 19th Amendment. It was coming up on the centennial. August 20th, 2020 was 100 years since the 19th Amendment was ratified. So there was going to be this big celebration. And I said to Kevin, you got to make a game and you got to release it around this time, a great hook and super interesting story, make for a great game. And he goes, yeah, I think you're right that it would make a great game, but I don't think I'm going to make it. I'm like, oh, well, fine. You're going to make it, he said to me. And that launched my career as a game designer. I was a pretty normie gamer. Carcassonne. I still love Ticket to Ride. Some 2-player games. It's mostly how I play with my husband. So, I played some games, but I wasn't even sure where to start. But fortunately, I got a copy of Watergate right before the pandemic, of everything shutting down. We're going to need some new stuff to do. Let's find a game. And a history game, a game about, this interesting moment. And so that really opened my eyes on what kind of stories you can tell and ask players to take part in as a game designer.
It's really interesting that it was a particular subject. It was a particular, narrative perspective that you came into this versus being obsessed with puzzles or being obsessed with making games before. And it's interesting because the more people that I talk to have similar experiences, that even if they become quite obsessed with game mechanics, it always goes back to the story. It always goes back to the subject matter.
I hear conversations or, see folks online talking about how, is it was it theme first or mechanics first? And that I can't even put myself into the shoes of someone that starts with mechanics and then layers a theme or a design onto it. It is so opposite of everything that happened with Votes for Women and how I think about these things. That every piece, every mechanic, every design choice, every bit of Votes for Women came out of the research, the history, and my own experience in movement politics and the story I want to tell about participation and joining in causes that we care about to make our cities, states, country, and world a better place. So for me, I found mechanics that mapped onto the history and the story I wanted to tell. The the breadth of play, these folks that start with mechanics and then find themes, like they must play a bajillion games and then sort of siphon through to get like the mechanics that they're interested in, that they think would be fun, that they're missing in the market or are really popular in the market. But I did not care what was popular in the market. I cared about what worked, what told this story.
It's so refreshing to hear that. You need to be choosing the right mechanic for the right moment, and not the other way around. And it just seems like if you, at least whenever I've seen implementations that are the opposite, that maybe come from a mechanic lover, you end up running the risk of it being a little overcomplicated or overcomplicating a certain action that doesn't necessarily feel natural. Whereas the best games, the mechanics might actually be quite simple, even if the game is quite complex, because they are so relevant to, that interaction. Speaking of interactions and mechanics and politics, Watergate. So Watergate is the game we're gonna dig into and geek out about today. And so it's from 2019, and so relatively recent game. Tell me about it. Like why did you choose it? You said you were looking for a game that was to pass the time. What about it stood out?
So a few things. It was in the window of my friendly little game store, Labyrinth, here in DC, and immediately, I've gone to U.S. history class. I've watched all the President's Men. I had the basic shapes of this story, and the idea that you could gamify it, that you could play Nixon or play one of the Washington Post journalists who are trying to break open the story, was super interesting to me. Like this sort of role, there's a little bit of role playing in the game that I thought was super cool. It is a 2-player game that's honestly pretty simple to learn. And that's also important to me and how I play and the kind of games that I approached. I don't want to spend 3 hours learning how to play a game. Some people, that's part of the challenge. Some people, that's the part of the experience. That has been a nightmare for me and my husband playing games.
I completely hear you. One of the big barriers for me to play games is the rule books. And if anybody says, "Oh, watch these 5 videos before," you've lost me, man.
What I really hate is when the publisher has a video. I'm like, oh, great. There's a video and they're just reading the rule book. I can read the rule. Please don't read the rule book to me. That's even more condescending. What I often would really like are some of these, we have a Watch It Played video that Rodney did for Votes for Women. And it's enough of a shift on it that if reading the rule book didn't land everything in your brain, then the video is a different approach. And that, I think, is the most important aspect of a great tutorial video, is that it's different enough from the rule book that I can get what I wasn't getting from just reading it to myself.
Yeah, it caters to a different type of learner.
Right.
And it kind of that virtual stand-in for, all right, let's just try and figure it out once through, which I'm sure everyone loves as much as me.
But my husband really wants to win the first time around, and so when we're still working on the rules, then it's this is my plan, and it's just okay, and so now when we play, we assign, someone has to be the teacher, someone has to watch the video, someone has to read through the rule book, and someone has to then walk through. And we're still oh, I'm not sure, let me look that up. But we'll both just sit down and start playing and figure it out as we go. Has not been effective for my game.
Power. I'm trying to work in a Watergate joke in there, but it's just not coming. So it's a 2-player game, which is really interesting. Obviously, it's one of the most popular, dynamics. But usually you might have 2 to 4, and so it knows what it is. But you say it's relatively simple. What elements are, if you could think of any examples of an element that is particularly maybe elegant in that kind of right mechanic for the right moment type of way.
So the board itself is the image is of a cork board, and you are pinning evidence, right? So think about, like we've seen in movies or TV shows, right? Sort of crazy boards where you are trying to connect the dots, right? You've got this break-in at the Watergate Hotel. You've got the president. How do you how do you put it all together? And so the board itself is a very simple layout of this web, and making straight lines and connecting as the journalists, while the president is trying to obscure, to disconnect, right? So it's this sort of one-to-one, very simple map, and then there's a single track as momentum is shifting back and forth from the president to the journalists. So a map and a track. If you look at Votes for Women, there's a map and a track. And right, like I use a map of the United States in 1920. This is like this, sort of idea, sort of investigation map. But there are other games I was influenced by. 1960, Making of a President one. There's like 3 or 4 different tracks. There's a lot more happening, and the simplicity of Watergate, that sort of momentum marker, and this like trying to tie things together. It fits the theme super well, and it is just sort of visually pleasing to connecting people and events and the president, and sort of monitoring your momentum and who has the upper hand, who is going to get fired, who is going to resign, that kind of a thing.
So going from something like Watergate, I can't wait to play it because definitely politics buff.
The DMV, you love the DMV, but the DMV can't leave you.
Oh my goodness! But in Maryland, of course, they didn't call it that. They call it the MVA to try and make it sound nicer than it is.
What about the DC? You're just erasing the DC part.
I know, it's right there. Yeah. But the MVA is actually when you go to return your
I see what you're saying.
It's the MVA.
That's right. The Maryland
It's not MVA, but it's a double thing. But really looking forward to playing it. But talk me through then. You've already kind of hinted that like this served as an inspiration for you on a couple of different ways, right? We have this like, you can actually make history into exciting enough for people to play. There's some mechanical stuff. Walk me through like what was the process like of you both maybe playing this game, starting to get into other games, hearing from your friend that maybe you should design something. How does that turn into a game that's an incredible success on Kickstarter and is already on its second printing?
There's a lot of magic and unknown forces, that kind of a thing. One of the interesting things about Watergate is that Nixon can win. The sort of ahistorical, right? Like asking players to take the role of someone who history has not deemed a hero, and you give them victory conditions, you give them resources, and you want to play Nixon screwing with these reporters, right? And I really like that. I thought that was an interesting challenge to players and opportunity to not just so you're learning about this era in history, and all of these different pieces of the game are the different people that you learn about in history books, and the crazy cast of characters, but that like I had forgotten from class or watching these movies. In Watergate pulls them back out of a textbook and puts them on your board, where Margaret Mitchell is making these like provocative claims and like drunk at the department store or whatever it is, and is sort of creating momentum for the journalists. And so you're learning, you're playing, you are sort of putting yourself into shoes that you maybe never would have expected to. But but when Nixon wins. He doesn't resign from president. He finishes his term, and like that's the way the game plays. And so for Votes for Women, players either take the side of suffrage and the suffragists and organizing and doing all of that work, or the other player takes the side of opposition. And so that two-sided game, where it's not just a run-through of history, but our players have the active agency to disrupt, to create momentum, to block, to win, is, I think, really interesting, and was a big piece of Votes for Women, was that freedom to take on an anti-hero role and to sort of play it out.
It's interesting because we had chatted about this before. How can you make a historically focused game seem in any way some sort of risk of failure when everybody knows what's going to happen, right? And so in some situations, especially quote, quote, far back in history, or issues that seem like they're farther back in history, but no issue seems to be as far back as you think. If you have to play Hitler, you can get excited about playing Hitler or playing Nixon, but it seems like it might be a different challenge when you're talking about, oh yeah, you're playing not allowing women the right to vote. I admire the fact that you see this as an opportunity to engage not only in a fun game and learn a bit of history, but actually like make people think. So how did you think about that as this kind of concept that many people feel is a stand-in for other rights that are threatened today? How did you approach that when designing the game in a way that had that balance of chills and thrills,
So I, was a nerdy little kid. I had a book of, distinguished American women that had a bunch of the suffragists in it. I took history, in high school. I took women's history courses in college. And my understanding of the opposition to suffrage was incredibly slight. There are books and books and books about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Alice Paul and all these pieces, right, of the heroes of our story. But there is not a well-developed narrative, or at least a sort of like container about opposition. So I was curious. I wanted to know, right? Like, I didn't think it was just a bunch of crappy dudes that didn't like women, right? Like, I assumed there was something more. There were crappy dudes that didn't like women. I found them. They were, thank you, gentlemen. But there were a lot of women organizing against suffrage. There were women that were speaking out against suffrage. And everything from Josephine Dodge, who was sort of the Phyllis Schlafly of her day, or maybe, I don't know, like the Ann Coulter, some of these trad wives now, who were just like vociferous, out, passionate organizing, that this was not something women should need, should want, should have, to women like Emma Goldman, who is a radical anarchist, who opposed suffrage because voting was bull, right? Like, voting was a waste of time when what we really needed was revolution. So we saw opposition from women on every facet you could oppose from, to radical and not radical enough. You also saw industry organizing against suffrage, and that the suffrage movement and the temperance movement that pushed for prohibition were so tightly intertwined because the anti-alcohol crusaders saw suffrage as a vehicle for accomplishing their aims. And so the alcohol industry paid a bunch of money to oppose suffrage campaigns and to line the pockets of legislators who could oppose the suffrage amendments and laws in the states. So industry, women themselves, some men, and the role of race in suffrage is also something that's actually been sort of obscured, right? Like, the suffrage story I know is white women like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul wanted to vote, and they worked real hard, and then they got it, right? But this period of history from 1848 to 1920 is incredibly rich and complicated, right? We're talking about the abolition movement, Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the reign of terror that's happening across the South as Jim Crow laws are coming into effect. Race colors everything in American politics, and the suffrage movement is no different. So including aspects of opposition and support for suffrage that were colored by the issue of race was also really important. So to approach opposition, I had to be curious, to want to be respectful of the arguments that I disagree with completely, and to ultimately understand that if you are part of a rights-based movement, if you are part of a group of people that are searching for justice, there will be people who oppose you. And if you want to overcome opposition today, you have to not pretend like you are fighting against cartoon monsters, but really understand the motivations and the arguments, so that then you can find the people in the middle that will join you instead of the opposition and continue this work of creating a more perfect nation.
Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of know their arguments better than they do, right?
I mean,
In
it's
many
kind of
ways.
cliche in wargaming about Sun Tzu, right? And to know the enemy better than yourself. Like, I don't go there.
Yeah.
But
From a design perspective, the job that you have to do to make the subject matter engaging and to convey the ideas that you want to convey and to be thought-provoking the way that you want to provoke, you have to make those elements certainly that you and many people would disagree with. You need to make them real. So as you say, like, they can't just be cartoon monsters. Otherwise there's this kind of inherent imbalance, and game design imbalance is not good. So like, how did you approach that from a mechanics perspective? Because it sounds like opposition could be from the perspective of individuals. Maybe there were some personalities. It can be for traditions. It can be society, there are a lot of their concepts, just like fundamental concepts. How did you personify, or how did you think about personifying the opposition to the suffrage movement in a way that then fit with the game mechanics, or the opposite? How did you design mechanics that could bring that out?
it was certainly the most daunting research task to then inform the deck for opposition. I still have a bunch of concepts and notions that I wish were in the suffrage deck. Like the fact that
Expansion.
I know everyone says expansion, right? Just like the role that the creation of the safety bike, the bicycle as we know it today, creating autonomy for women and the way that it opened not just space but time for women to go organize. I didn't get to put a bike card in because there was just too much else. Like, I don't know, there's just so a bloomer and the way that women's dress changed, all of these factors, right? Like, so the decision on the suffrage deck was about bringing it down. The difficulty or the challenge of the opposition deck was just to get enough cards. And there are ways that, like, mostly I've talked about how the mechanics or the research drove the mechanics. It became clear as like the game was starting to sort of flesh out. Like I started with this map, it's territorial control. You're trying to build power in 36 out of 48 states because Article 5 of the Constitution says so, right? Like, thanks, James Madison. But it became clear that like there's the history is this long period of organizing out in the states and a very short period of lobbying Congress effectively to get a constitutional amendment sent to the states. And how does that happen? Like, how in the game, right? So you've got, like the Kansas campaign is happening, and Pennsylvania has rejected the amendment. Like the state stuff all sort of tells the story itself on the map. This piece of moving from organizing to ratification, eventually figured out that I needed a congressional track. I needed a sort of tipping point for congressional support that then creates the conditions for what the game calls final voting. And so as that congressional track came into formation and like, okay, like really need to give, like, how does this amendment or this Supreme Court decision affect what's happening in Congress, that I needed more research on senators who were opposing the ratification amendment, which was up for debate for 40 years, right? From 1876 until 1919, every year the amendment was debated and rejected, essentially. So creating the mechanic of the congressional track, which is 6 columns that are put through either there's some dice play or through the cards, I needed a bunch of senators to fill out the opposition deck that would remove support from Congress as we're playing through the game. And so I went into the congressional record. I went into a bunch of suffrage history books that were complaining about these certain congressmen and senators that were, biting opposition. And so, seeing these congressmen pull up through the deck, I tried to find pictures, because there's a lot of art in this deck of the grumpiest, the big mustachioed, right? I the people that I watch play the game that get the most into it history-wise are having a lot of fun with stereotypes, with some of the accents. Yeah, there's a lot of Southern opposition, as you might imagine. So the sort of some of the like imagery going into the opposition deck, I hope invites people to have fun with it. But at the same time, you're not just seeing the senator from Georgia, you're seeing this, right, like Catherine Beecher, who is very uptight and hoity-toity looking, opposing suffrage, right? That it is sort of the imagery evokes this kind of have fun with it feel, because it can, and people say it just feels like your only job as opposition is to undo what suffrage is doing, where really I want folks to sort of have a sense of they were trying to preserve, they were holding on to these notions that in my 21st century position I say are harmful and limiting and right, but in their
that was their reality.
That was their reality. Yeah, exactly.
In terms of the gameplay itself and the reaction to it, what are some of the things that you've discovered from how people have reacted to the game that maybe were as expected or maybe that weren't as expected, whether it's through playing it, through the fact that it even exists, in the first place? I mean, we talked before about, do people feel uncomfortable playing against suffrage?
So the reaction has been overwhelming. I was not prepared for people to be as supportive, as interested, as like into it as they have been. Really fortunate that Fort Circle had a base of support and that those folks were early adopters of Votes for Women, the folks that were just sort of intrigued by the theme. And then once the game was released, the like sort of content creator interest in Votes for Women, and so Twitch streamers and folks on podcasts and YouTube channels, folks that are really active on Twitter with big following base, like have been like, this is unlike a lot of other games. It is like fun to play. It's beautiful. It hits on sort of all of these things, right? It's not another game about Gettysburg, right? So it hits on a lot of things, and that's been wonderful. I think I expected a certain amount of folks who don't like that it exists, right? And sometimes I see on Board Game Geek reviews that it is just about about its existence and not about its gameplay or its what this or that, right? Like any of that. So, I mean, and some of it has been, I think, kind of useful. There's this Amazon review, and it is Gerald's Amazon review. It came in pretty early, and Gerald says that he bought his wife this game because it says women on it, and
she happens to be a woman,
and she's a woman, so and that it is full of politics. Avoid this game because, surprise, a game called Votes for Women about the ratification of a constitutional amendment has politics in it. And so that was like to screen grab and share that around. Folks had a lot of fun with it. Reached new audiences. There is a certain amount of taking some of these negative reviews and accusations and whatever to folks that get it. I think there is a thirst for a part of the market. It is not the whole market. Like, my game is not on the shelves of Target. It is not but
that's a kind of a beautiful thing. You haven't had to mass market this out,
No, it has been word of mouth. It has been folks talking to each other. It has been content creators who want to highlight it because they think their audience would find it interesting. And so it's been lovely, right? And there are folks that don't like the gameplay. Some folks are like, I wanted to like it, but I tend to not like dice, and this game has dice in it, right? Sometimes they're not negative reviews, but it's just like, this game isn't for me. And there are a lot of games out there that are not for me. I've played a game that's not for me, and that's you can't please everyone, or else you'd just be tacos. And I'm not tacos, right? Like, I'm not, everyone doesn't just love me because I'm right. Like, anyway. So, some of the negative reviews get kind of personal. I don't really need that in my life. I try not to like focus too much, but I try to tell myself that like the alternative is that my game never gets played, never gets seen, never gets talked about, right? That the very existence of conversation about my game that I desperately want people to play and see and interact with necessitates, like guarantees this sort of backside. And those folks are going to need to like deal with themselves. It's up to, I think, people in the Discord servers where they have these conversations to say like, what kind of hobby do we want to be? What kind of society do we want to be? I mean, this is the same conversation that was happening during suffrage, right? What kind of society do we want to be? We will continue to have this conversation as long as we're a society. And that's like, the alternative is not having a society. And we live in a society. And I want to continue.
And hopefully. We all hope
Sometimes the ties seem to be fraying a bit.
Yeah. I wonder, does your reaction to feedback, or if we're generously calling it feedback or reviews, it's very kind of big picture, and I think that a lot of game designers struggle with feedback and negative feedback. And I wonder if your background as an activist and as someone who's been in movement politics for so long, I don't know, it allows you to see the benefit in someone who has been motivated enough to write about it, even if that writing wasn't necessarily positive.
What did they say? All press is good press, or something
all press
like
is good
that,
press.
right?
No, I mean more like, I don't know, the best activists engage with people and have conversations, and it just feels very much like your mission here is to have conversations. It's not necessarily to beat people on the back of the head.
Right. And if I made a game about puppy dogs and rainbows, there would be people that are like, puppy dogs suck, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
there is no. I do think in my work, I think a lot about audience. Who am I talking to? What do they care about? What do I need from them? I think about non-persuadable audiences, the people who there is no right argument, there is no clever turn of phrase, there is no nothing that will ever get them to see things the way I do and take the action that I want them to take. And so to expend energy, to waste time, to focus on a part of the market that is not responsive to the product that I'm selling is a disservice to the part of the market that I am, like the people that are interested in picking up my game. Some of my favorite feedback has been from people that are like, I don't really care about women's history, but this game is neat. Like, I mean, I really want people who care about women's history to play, and I want people outside of the hobby to see this game as like, oh, it's not just machine guns and artillery. It is about these different ideas and these conflicts and this power and who has power and who gets power and that kind of a thing, right? Like, I want gamers to play my game. I want non-gamers to play my game. I don't want dickheads to play my game. And if I spent all of my time focused on how do I get the dickhead market segment, then I'm not doing service to the folks that I think will play, enjoy, and be motivated to join a movement, to take part in some bigger action that helps in their local civic society, in their nation, in their state. So I have to be really just sort of, focused and, dedicated to the people that will play my game and the people that might play my game, and just let go the folks that are going to be pissy babies on my Board Game Geek threads and
and use them regardless by sharing screenshots
yes!
and driving sales.
Exactly. Yes.
You build for the audience that you want, and you just hope that audience is small enough to make it cool, but big enough to make it profitable. and it seems like, not then selling out that view of like trying to then broaden the appeal or trying to not offend anyone. If you build something for everyone, you end up serving no one. And it seems as though you've you've balanced that, going back to balance, you balance that really, really interestingly in what's quite a politically conscious game.
It is. Its approach to sort of the balance of power in the states, the focus on, right, like I work and live in Washington, D.C. A lot of folks are like, they come to D.C. because they want to change the world. A lot of my work has oddly been about sending those people back to where they come from and saying, like, if you want to change the world, change your block. If you want to make difference, make it in your town. If you want to really feel the effects of legislation, make it at your state house. That ultimately, especially now, given incentive structures and campaign finance and the way we elect elected representatives, Congress tends to be where good things come to die rather than change happens. So even the fact that the game focuses players on organizing in the states is a conscious decision about my politics of, it's not just a game about Congress that has some stuff that's happening out where everybody lives, but the game is about where everybody lives, and Congress is a tiny little track. The conscientiousness of sometimes there's a card that looks super enticing, where you sacrifice the rights of Black women in order to make politically expedient progress in the South. That can really screw you in my game, because in my value set, punting some people off of the boat in order to make that boat go faster doesn't actually accomplish the goals that I am trying to accomplish. So there's a lot of my personal values threaded through the game that may not be noticed by some players, may not be appreciated by others, but I think ultimately games have this opportunity, this potential for communicating some of these ideas in a way that isn't just like a tweet thread that only people on my old Twitter account would see, or come to a speech or have a debate about on MSNBC, right? Like, games not just reach new people, but it reaches them often in their homes or at a local cafe. It reaches them in their imagination, that they have agency as a part of it. And so I am super hot on games as a political organizing tool because of this sort of agency, imagination, intimacy, all of these pieces that you lose in other sort of settings. And the suffragists knew this. The suffragists made games about their issue to try to get folks to play. The British suffragettes had Panko Squith, and there's another board games. The American suffragists had like a gin rummy game where you play suffragists versus opposition, and that people who wouldn't come to a speech or a rally might sit in their kitchen and play a game as an opportunity to meet people where they are.
This is the first game that you've developed,
yeah.
And quite a game to be the first one that you developed. So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit of, more about that, about what you've learned as a first-time game designer. But also, it's really interesting that this isn't your full-time thing, and you don't want it to be your full-time thing. And so the idea of actually feeling happy enough to say, yeah, I'm going to make this, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself. I want to keep what I'm doing. Is really interesting, and a lot of people, hopefully, that are listening are in the same boat. They have a job, they have a career, and they just really want to make a game, or they really want to maybe start making them on the side. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective of going through this process this production, this ideation, development, and production process as a first-time game designer, and how you think about that going forward.
I was, like I talked about, like I knew a game like I was friends with a game publisher. Not everybody, that was pretty unique. Not everybody has the kind of like, someone pitch me a game, right? Most people are desperately trying to figure out how to find someone to pitch a game to. And I try to be as honest as I can about that in these kinds of settings, because it's just not normal and how it usually works. I'm also in Washington, D.C., where there's just a rack of amazing designers. Like Elizabeth Hargrave lives here. She shows up at events I go to and is like, how's it going, Tory? It's crazy. Connie Vogelman as well, now with Apiary and Wormspan. There's Jason Matthews created 1960 Making of a President, which is a huge inspiration. He was a senior playtester for me and helped me think through the way to connect some cards and to create some effects and how I could sort of stack as the game progressed some of these storylines. It is like, I also created Votes for Women while I was unemployed and newly sober. So I had a ton of time and a lot of energy and needed something to like drive myself deep into. And it was also during the pandemic, like we talked about, so there was nowhere to go, right? So as far as, eliminating distractions and having people that you can work with, I am beyond the moon lucky. And I think it shows. Like, I think it's clear in the game that there's just a lot going right for Votes for Women. My publisher is super supportive and willing to give it the sort of lush production that not everybody gets from a publisher. I do think that we had a great playtest process. Because my publisher had learned from Shores of Tripoli, there's just a nice, pretty thorough Google sheet that every playtester was asked to fill out. I mean, the process of like taking or rejecting playtester comments is its own, right? You could do an episode on like. I can just like send you 3 notes that I got and ones that I took that piece of it. I told that guy to go screw himself. And I took this changed the game, right? That kind of a thing, right? Is super interesting. My challenge now is that I am 4 years sober. So I'm not as not as deep in it as I was at that moment. I'm working.
You found other distractions?
I found other distractions, right? And I'm just more at peace in myself in a way that I wasn't in that moment. I'm also now working. And so, when I had these huge chunks of time during the day, I now need to figure out a way to be more disciplined about carving time, about research, and about finding inspiration and playing other games, because I just don't have the same amount of time. So I'm, like a lot of your listeners, still trying to work it out. I think that you're right that my ambition is not to become a full-time game designer. I feel that kind of pressure on production and you gotta produce 4 games a year to unless you're Elizabeth Hargrave, right, to keep that going and to make it reasonable. I like what I do. What I do feeds the game design, and the game design feeds back to the right. I also can't imagine having to sort of start thinking about games in a way that this is how I'm going to eat. I think that would push me toward, I gotta then find a game about birds that everyone and a million people will play. So
that's what the market says.
That's what they want, which is not what they want. Nobody wants another bird game. That's been done, right? That they want is the next thing. So keeping my day job as stability and it frees me up to pursue the kind of passion project that I want. I mean, if I had to just pick a topic because I thought it was popular and dig in, I don't think it would create the kind of art, the kind of super compelling kind of thing, because I would just be going through the motions. So I'm excited about what comes next and about finding a routine. And I don't think that for me, the full-time piece would be as rewarding as it sort of as a hobby, as a, opportunity to, stretch a different part of my brain. If I was only stretching my game design part of my brain, I think it would get tired. And I want to be able to go in these sort of different directions.
It feels like a luxury when you don't have to do it. So therefore you end up taking it even more passionately, if that makes, I don't know if that makes sense. I totally get that. So in terms of the way in which just the nuts and bolts of how you went about doing this is you developed the idea, you then put it on Kickstarter before you actually had the mechanics, or had you designed the whole game already?
Mishmash. So I had completed most of the research, had started building out the decks, had the concept of the map and how that was going to work. I think the congressional track, as I mentioned, is sort of like a later, right, like sort of next phase addition. But so I had, right, the basic pieces, and like you look at the Kickstarter from 2020, there's, sort of a previous draft of the art for the board, for the cards. It has the sort of, right, like go over, the 100 years of history and that kind of a thing. But I, before the Kickstarter or during did not have a rule book, had not done any serious playtesting. It was really concept-y, right? Like there was good, deep concept there, but people were turned off by that, right? Like so many publishers use Kickstarter as a pre-order system where their full marketing suite is available, slick graphics and shiny videos and the full, right, comments from these. And now I'm seeing, right, content creators that are, right, playing games and saying, now go back to Kickstarter, right? These are finished products that are on Kickstarter. Like, we needed Kickstarter to fund playtest kits. There just wasn't money from like a big time publisher. So it was, in that first round, not a lot that went up on the Kickstarter, but there were enough people with enough support and belief in my publisher, in the theme, and in the bare bones of what they saw that it went. I don't know if I would recommend it, but it worked for us.
And when you did it, you then how long did it take then from the Kickstarter ending in 2020 to people getting the game?
It took 2 years.
So in that time, people, as you were saying, the Kickstarter was funding the playtesting kits, and it was funding all this kind of stuff. So did you find that period of time was a net positive when it comes to developing the community, or doing it again? Would you do it a little closer to when it was ready? How do you feel about that?
During that 2 years,
Yeah.
I hated it because I had friends and family who backed the Kickstarter who gave me money and that were like, where's my game? How is it going? What's happening? What's happening? Is that game still happening? And enough things have gone poof on Kickstarter that it's like a reasonable question, right? And some of the delays were like logistics, and our printing shop we use Panda in China, and like it just like things. It was the pandemic. Things weren't going. There were closures. There were opens. The cost of getting things from China to the States was really high. Like it wasn't all just like I'm still fiddling with the rule book. It was like a lot of these different pieces. I don't think that it like gained anything in like buzz or like, oh, most anticipate. Like that was not sort of the situation. In fact, I think we had Kickstarters drop out because they were like reasonably like, where is it? Yeah. I would recommend to folks to have a little bit more than I had once they're ready. I mean, I think it doesn't have to be the finished product. I think you should be able to reinvest Kickstarter funds into development, maybe better art, that kind of a thing. But it was like super uncomfortable at the time, and just like my impatience. Like I try to tell people like, what would you tell designers? Like 2 things, like have a lot of passion about the thing you're working on and a lot of patience. And those 2 things do not coexist in lots of people, right? Like you got to like really work on those. So
they don't sit well.
It was tough.
So you had the second printing. What went into putting it? Like, why did you do it on Kickstarter versus like just straight selling it, and how'd that all go?
Sure. So the second Kickstarter was really to not exploit, but to take advantage of the marketing pipeline that has been created around Kickstarter, right? Kickstarter isn't an island. It is like a plumbing system where all of these tubes and pipes connect to it. And so once you go up on Kickstarter, folks who have previously backed on Kickstarter or folks who are in that area get promoted, and then different, I think like the Dice Tower people have a show just about Kickstarter packages, and right, there's all of this environment around Kickstarter. So the second printing to take benefit of that ecosystem, became to, I think, capitalize on the word of mouth and the wide support that we'd received since releasing last year, became, a pretty clear it was just like a no-brainer to go back on Kickstarter for the second printing. What was a surprise was when Facebook rejected some paid ads that my publisher tried to put up. Pretty simple, right? Like Votes for Women back on Kickstarter, play now kind of a thing. The Kickstarter AI algorithm, whatever, they have people in a back room somewhere, rejected the ads because, as they said, it was a sensitive social issue that could affect the election, which obviously they've gotten in lots of trouble for other ads in previous elections, and they overcorrected, let's say. But Mike at Board Game Wire saw my publisher's post on Twitter about stupid Facebook, and he wrote a story that did very well and attracted a lot of attention about whether Facebook opposes the right for women to vote or to, right? Like that kind of thing. So we had comments on the Kickstarter of people saying, I'm here to say screw Mark Zuckerberg. Like, okay, great. Like, sure. So while the first Kickstarter reached, I think, $29,000, and I was so excited about that $29,000 in August 2020, the second printing Kickstarter reached nearly $200,000. It was out of control. It was on par to do much better than that first one, but we saw like $100,000 spike from around the earned media of Facebook. Now, like Facebook ads, you pay what gets posted. It's $50 here, $100 there. Who knows what if those ads had been placed, what they would have done? But it is clear that the rejection was to our benefit, and there, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Totally. I mean, and technically, Facebook drove traffic to your project, so
should we pay?
I mean, like, Zuck should be happy, right?
And the exciting piece about like my publisher had already put in the order at Panda for the second printing. It is essentially sold out. Like the Kickstarter did so well. There was more interest on retail backers that were sort of separate from the Kickstarter process that essentially we need to start like organizing for the third printing because it did so well, which is wonderful. It's the best kind of problem to have.
Best kind of problem.
We had sold out last year before Christmas. I'd really love for people to be able to buy, especially my game has sort of hit this niche of like gamers buy it to play with people that don't normally play a lot of games. A lot of like wargaming dads to play with their daughters, talk about like, kind of complex technical game players to play with their mom. A lot of like dudes playing it with women that don't necessarily want to play other kinds of games. And so it is like around gift time, right? Like around Christmas, totally. Like a good marketing moment. And again, right, like knowing that about your market, knowing who's buying for who has been really helpful in sort of timing for these specific moments for ensuring retail stock.
Any other kind of maybe nuts and bolts advice that you'd give to other people who might be thinking about, about maybe making their own game or wanting to get into it, that maybe looking back on it, you hadn't necessarily realized when you were just starting out?
I think that like the value of community, I underappreciated how word of mouthy this hobby can be, how important it is to have people who like your game to talk about it to other people. In the 90s, we had what we called street teams. And like if you really liked a band, you could join the band street team and you'd pass out CDs or stickers, or you'd talk to your friends at high school or whatever, right? Like it is essentially, that the 21st, century version of street teams, right? Like I couldn't, we couldn't put a huge splash on Board Game Geek about the game, right? Like it can be really expensive to do paid advertising and kind of questionable results. But what you can't buy and is invaluable is word of mouth. And so having something like the people that backed Shores of Tripoli that then were able, like, I give you the benefit of the doubt, right? Like that kind of a thing was really helpful.
Really cool. Awesome. Well, Tory, thank you so much for taking quite a bit of time away from your life in order to talk to me and to share your perspectives and experiences and geek out a little bit about Watergate and all that with me today. If anybody would like to find out more about Votes for Women, you can follow them on Instagram on the handle Votes for Women, and you can find Tory on Blue Sky on Downtown T Brown. And you can also find and order Votes for Women. You can find out more information about it and where to order it on www.votesforwomen.com. Tory, thanks again for joining me.
Rob, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.